How does one think in the game of chess? How does one make decisions? What criteria determines what decisions or how we evaluate a specific situation or position? Well, this lesson hopes to take a look at that and provide some perspective to the new player, how to think during a game, and how good players think when they play. A common misconception is that the best players are constantly thinking 5, 10, 20 moves ahead. That's both correct and incorrect. In a certain way, people do think very far ahead in chess games, but not in specific move combinations, as there are a near infinite amount of potential moves, and even with 3 or 4 potentially good moves in any situation, if you extrapolate that 5 or 10 moves down the road, we have an unsustainable amount of calculation to do, especially for a human. That being said, good players understand the patterns and positions of the game. They understand in general principles where good squares are for their pieces, what is a good piece and what is a bad piece, understand how to evaluate the position based on both concrete and abstract criteria, and how to turn an abstract evaluation into a concrete plan that can lead to a victory. So we're going to take a look at a little bit of that today. So, as we were saying, how do strong players think? They're not Nostradamus and they're not psychics where they can think 10 to 20 moves ahead, although that's certainly not impossible. Most of the time, players think a few moves ahead specifically within the realm of human calculation and within the time constraint of the game. But in general, players also fall back on their natural intuitive algorithms. And I've identified 4 specific components that are going to help make up your own system of how you think when you play. The first thing is, what are you doing in your position? That's your to-do list. It's making a plan. There's an old saying, if you fail to plan, your plan is to fail. This is extremely true in chess, as it's very easy to get sidetracked, be scared of ghosts, second guess yourself, or end up shuffling pieces around and not really accomplishing much of anything, while your opponent builds up incremental advantages that they then can convert into a win. So having a plan of attack, or a to-do list, as we will call it in this lesson, is extremely important. A good player also understands what their opponent is doing. If you can understand what your opponent's plans and threats are, you can counter or parry them, or you can avoid falling victim to any of your opponent's plans. Next, a good player understands the position on the board. They know how to read the pieces, they understand what pieces have value, and what specific elements or components of the board attribute to the overall evaluation of the position. Is it a good piece? Is it a good pawn structure? What exactly is happening? And then lastly, a good player understands how moves affect the position. Because we can't just pass in chess. Every move, we have to make a specific decision as to how are we going to advance our position. Every move we make comes with both advantages and disadvantages. Ultimately, we would like to pick moves that maximize our advantages while minimizing our disadvantages. Now, and there are many cases where it's very hard to find a move with absolutely only upsides and no downsides, as even very innocuous moves come with downsides, as we looked at in our analysis game from the first lesson. So let's start at the top. What is a threat? A threat is anything that our opponent can potentially levy at us. So it could be an attack against the king, either a check, which has to be addressed immediately, or in a decisive sense, checkmate is the ultimate threat because it ends the game immediately. A threat could be a gain in material, whereas if you don't address a specific threat, they will take, and it will end up with 2 pawns and you only have 1 pawn, or they may end up with one of your knights or bishops, while you only end up with one of their pawns. And a clear material advantage is one of the easiest ways for especially beginner and intermediate players to win games. So this is especially something that new players need to look out for, because you can win a lot of games just by achieving a material advantage, and you're going to lose a lot of games by giving up a material advantage and not being able to recover. A threat could either gain a very good position for a piece. For example, it could open up a line of attack with a queen, a rook, or a bishop. It could potentially mean control of a specific square that prevents your opponent from moving there, or it could be a very good outpost, let's say for a knight in an advanced position in a place where the opponent cannot capture it with a bishop of the opposite color, and they would have to use a rook or a piece of higher value in order to capture that very well advanced and protected knight. And any sort of other either tactical or strategic advantage or combination that may come up on a turn-by-turn basis. While understanding your opponent's threats are important, we also need to discriminate between what are important threats and what are not, because it's very easy to find lots of what I like to call ghosts in a position, whereas, oh no, this could potentially happen, or that could potentially happen. When we are analyzing threats, we need to make sure that we are evaluating the relevancy of that specific threat to the position. The example we're using today is evaluating whether or not giving up the bishop pair is okay in a position. The normal theoretical understanding is that a bishop pair is a advantage, not necessarily a material advantage, but a positional advantage. As we learned in the first lesson, each bishop can only cover its squares, either light squares or dark squares, and they cannot cross over. So having both of them in tandem means that you have full coverage of all of the colors of squares on the board, so there cannot be color complexes or color weaknesses. So in a certain way, having a bishop pair is an advantage, and not having a bishop pair is a disadvantage. But we have to evaluate that on a case-by-case basis. We could potentially be in a position where having a bishop pair is not going to do us any good at all, and I would much rather have a very well-placed knight as opposed to even two bishops. I will take one extremely good knight over two bishops that are blocked behind their pawns. For example, in a position like this, white has to make the situational decision as to whether knight takes e2 and this light squared bishop, whether this is a positionally good or bad exchange for white. So let's look at the position. As we talked about in the basics about the pieces, bishops enjoy open positions where they can take full advantage of their range, whereas knights prefer close quarters positions where they can utilize their ability to hop around and be quite annoying to create localized battles and also cover multiple colors of squares on multiple moves. Every time they move, they can cover the opposite color. So let's take a look at these two pieces. Let's maybe move this bishop right here so it's not directly attacking it. So white does have the bishop pair here, whereas black has a knight and a bishop. So white has the bishop pair while black does not. So that is technically a theoretical advantage for white. But let's look at the quality of these pieces. So you can see that black's knight is pretty awesome. It's protected very heavily. It's in white's camp on white's side of the board, and it cannot be dislodged very easily. Let's say it'd have to be with this particular bishop right here. So this is a pretty good knight. Let's look at this bishop. This bishop it doesn't really have a whole lot of mobility. It's kind of stuck behind these pawns. It's going to have a hard time getting into the game and influencing anything. So although theoretically a bishop pair is an advantage, in this particular position, I really don't want to have any bishops in this position at all because of the locked nature of the center and the inability for it really to open very easily. The knight that's going to be able to jump around is going to be the superior piece. So for white, not only would white be absolutely more than okay if black decided to make the decision to trade this knight for this bishop, white would also be willing to give up their own bishop pair to trade this dark squared bishop for that beautiful knight, because they've taken away a very key attacking piece for a relatively lackluster bishop slash defending piece here. Now, of course, that comes with consequences of their own, mainly the backwards nature of this pawn right here, but we'll talk more about that and more imbalances a little bit later. So just as a review, while theoretically the removal of the bishop pair is a potential threat in some positions, we have to review it on a case-by-case basis, and in the example of this particular position, white is not only happy to give up their bishop pair for that knight trading on the light squared bishop, but white should anyways be willing to give up their dark squared bishop in order to get rid of that critical and very active attacking piece that black has. So the next thing that good players understand are the consequences of moves. Every move both has good and bad effects. There are very rarely moves that only have positive effects and no negative effects. That comes with the game. Some examples of consequences of moves could potentially be the opening of a file or a diagonal for a rook or a queen or bishop. It could potentially be a blockade of a specific piece, either yours or your opponent's, which could either be good or bad. It could potentially weaken either your pawns, or it could potentially weaken a square. For example, go back to the first analysis game where we saw the move h3 by white weaken to that g3 square, which was ultimately used by black's queen. And once again, see that first analysis game in the first lesson if you forgot how g3 was a weak square. A consequence of a move could potentially be the removal of a defender of a key piece or a key square that could lead to either material or positional advantage for your opponent, as well as a number of other things that come up on a turn-by-turn or very situational basis, which we will cover in more depth throughout this program. So some key considerations when we're talking about the consequences of a move. The first one has to do with pawns. And we discussed this a bit when talking about pawns in the first lesson, that pawn moves are critical because they cannot be undone. Whereas a bishop or a knight can move forward and then just as easily move back, once a pawn moves forward, it is no longer able to move backwards. So every pawn move is a permanent weakening of the position in some regards. Whereas you cannot undo the move, you cannot move backwards, you can only move a pawn forwards. So once the weakness is made, it can't be unmade, at least through the defense of the pawns. Each pawn, with the exception of the pawns on the end, control two spaces. So every time a pawn moves, we have to think both advantageously and disadvantageously. The pawn no longer defends two squares, but it now defends two new squares, and we need to evaluate that. Whereas, is the pawn better defending the old two squares, or is it better defending the new two squares? Or is it controlling space in an area that is more advantageous to your position than where it was occupying space before you moved it. So pawn moves are always very critical considerations because they're very high consequence because they cannot be undone or taken back. Also along the lines of taking moves back is the concept of time. Every move expends one move worth of time in the scope of a game. An average game being about 40 moves. So every move expends about 2.5% of the overall time you have to make your plan come to fruition. So if you're making moves that are going against your plan or that are wasting time, in essence, you are giving your opponent free moves. To go back to our first analysis game from the first lesson, the pawn moves on the edge, a2 to a4 and then a4 to a5 and h2 to h3, we determined all three of those to be wasteful moves. So in essence, in a game that was I think about 20 moves or so, white effectively only played 17 of those moves because they wasted 3. So black got to play 20 moves, which advanced their plan, whereas white played considerably less moves that actually advanced their plan and other moves that were relatively wasteful. So black got more efficiency out of their time, and if you were able to make 3 moves free in a row in sequence of each other, you could do a lot of very aggressive attacking. Now, of course, you don't get to make 3 moves in a row, but over the course of the game, every wasted move you make could potentially be a proactive move that you could have made and an opportunity for your opponent to make a proactive move that's going to improve their position more than you improved yours with the previous move. Next, consequences of castling. Now we talked about castling and you can castle to both sides. A unique consequence of castling is this idea of opposite side castling, whereas you are castled on one side of the board and your opponent is castled on the other side of the board. This is a very special consequence and a special consideration because if your kings are not facing each other, then you can feel more free to push the pawns that are in front of your opponent's king. As we spoke in the first game, you don't want to move the pawns in front of your own king because it weakens your king position. But if you castle on opposite sides, then that is no longer a consideration, and you can feel comfortable to push the pawns that are in front of your opponent's king to try to break up their position and advance an attack. And that's something that you wouldn't do if your king was on the same side as your other king, because pushing those pawns, while it may advance an attack on their king, will also severely weaken your king's position. So the give and take, the cost benefit of moving your pawns in front of your king when your king and their king are on the same side, the cost is much higher, the benefit is much lower, as opposed to the opposite side castle. And last but certainly not least, every time we move a piece, much like when we were talking about pawns, every time we move a piece, some squares are being newly defended and some squares are no longer being defended. And we have to make sure that we're understanding the global implications of when we move a piece, whether that's going to leave a specific square, a specific pawn, or a specific piece either underdefended or undefended, which could lead to either your opponent occupying a favorable position or square for their pieces, or potentially capitalizing and capturing favorably a pawn or a piece that is underdefended. And that's an error in counting, whereas you allow a piece or a pawn that you own to have more attackers on it than you have defenders. And remember that material gain is the easiest way for players up to relatively high rank, and even very high ranked players. Having more pieces is the easiest way and the best way to win a game. The next thing good players do is they have a plan. Like we said in the beginning, if you fail to plan, your plan is to fail. And that's extremely true in chess. Sometimes this is called wood pushing, whereas people will go and just kind of make moves that they kind of look good, and I know I'm kind of supposed to do certain things, and kind of hold your breath and hope that it works out. Uh, that is already a considerable losing attitude. Uh, to have a plan is to have a specific concrete set of things that you're trying to accomplish in a specific position. So while we need to evaluate what our opponent's threats are and what our threats are after every move, a to-do list is a slightly more macro exercise that we want to do every so often. And so often, I say every so often without a specific move number because there is no right and specific move number. You need to make a new plan if your old plan is no longer sustainable. And sometimes your plan is sustainable and you can hold on to it for a very long time. Other times, your opponent makes a drastic change to their position, or something unexpected or unseen happens where you need to go back and you need to reevaluate given the new criteria for evaluation. So in that respect, you need to make that decision for yourself when you make a new to-do list. But my best advice is you need to make a new to-do list when your specific to-do list or plan is no longer attainable or relevant to the position. So in general, we want to say, what are all the things that we want to do in the short and intermediate term? Do we need to focus on development? Do we need to, or piece quality? Do we need to open up the position? Do we need to keep a position closed? Can we identify specific weaknesses? How can we exploit those specific weaknesses? Or how can I improve my position of either my pawns, my pieces, or as we get towards the game, how can I improve my king position to be more active and play more of a role in the fighting end game? Also, good players have a very well developed algorithm when they're making decisions when it comes to what move to make and what is their specific interpretation of a position. Is white better? Is black better? Is it equal? What are the factors that contribute to that specific decision? So how do we make decisions in chess? Well, to understand how we make decisions in chess, we need to first understand what is the purpose of making a move in chess. Because we have to make a move every turn, we can't just pass. Well, in simplest terms, the reason we make a move in chess, and the ultimate goal of a move in chess, is to do one of two things: to either increase our advantage or to decrease our opponent's advantage. So we either want to increase the amount of good things about our position, or we want to decrease the amount of good things or increase the amount of bad things about our opponent's position. Like we said, there are no perfect positions, so every position will come with both advantages and disadvantages, and it is the good player that can identify and exploit those. So let's go one level deeper. So we know why we make chess moves, because we're trying to improve our position or make our opponent's position less good or worse, if you will. So we want to maintain or create an advantage. So that's our key word there. So what exactly is an advantage? Well, we can break it down into two specific domains. We have quantitative advantages and we have qualitative advantages. So the quantitative advantages in chess are very straightforward. When you have more material than your opponents, you basically have more guys to work with. And if you watch hockey or sports that have penalties or things like that, if a hockey team is playing 5-on-3, call that the power play, right? Because they have more power because they have more people. That's the overall material advantage. If you have a queen and your opponent doesn't have a queen, you are winning because you have more firepower, you have more horsepower, you have more army resources to use when compared to your opponent. And if you were to trade down equally, ultimately you will be left with something, they will be left with nothing, and that allows you to win in many instances. Also, there's instances where material could be equal on the board, but you can have a quantitative army advantage in a specific area of the board. For example, going back to our first analysis game, White removed their defender of the king on f3 to capture Black's knight on e5, which left the White king basically defenseless. They had 3 pawns, one of which was moved and weakened. So basically you had 2 pawns, kind of 2.5 pawns protecting the king, and that's it. Whereas Black had both bishops, the queen, and a knight, all bearing down on the king's position. In our first game's example, which you can once again review or take a look at if you don't remember, Black had a very decisive local superiority of forces when it came to attacking White's kingside. That being said, material was equal on the board. As a matter of fact, White actually had more material because Black ended up sacrificing their c8 bishop on bishop takes h3. So Black won, but Black had less pieces because they had a better local superiority of forces around White's king. So you can have all the pieces, and if your opponent only needs a couple to checkmate you. So it doesn't matter how many pieces you have. If you get checkmated, you lose. It doesn't matter. It's not a scoreboard like basketball. It's a positional battle, and many times the person with less material can win if they utilize the local superiority of forces. So quantitative advantages are relatively straightforward. More theoretical and abstract are qualitative advantages, and these are specific things that are contextualized in specific positions, in specific scenarios. In some instances, things are weighed more heavily than others, but in general, all of these, put in some sort of dynamic balance, can help determine which side has a qualitative advantage, a given material being equal. First being king safety. Is the king safe? The king's not safe. If one king is safe, the side with the safe king is going to be less vulnerable to things like checks and ultimately checkmates. Next, the qualitative value of the pieces. This goes back to our example that we looked at of the good bishop, or the good knight that we had here before we captured, versus the very lackluster bishop. These two lackluster bishops versus this amazingly strong knight. I would never give up this knight. And my opponent, if I was the white pieces here, I would also try very hard to get rid of that knight, because it's qualitatively, this knight is better than probably both of these bishops put together, because it's actually doing something in the position, whereas these bishops, for all intents and purposes, really aren't. Also, we can have qualitative values of pawn structures. So as you know, our pawns are in a relative chain. Let's go ahead and reset our position right here. And there are many instances in chess where we can get major pawn structure issues. For example, this is called the Nimzo-Indian. A3 variation, bishop takes c3, followed immediately by c5. Black has sacrificed a pawn. As you can see, Black has 7 pawns. White has 8 pawns. But what is the qualitative state of White's pawn position? By the way, this is a theoretical position. This does exist in the Nimzo-Indian defense. Black here is, at least I certainly prefer Black, because it's very easy for Black to coordinate their pieces. Queen c7, so they're going to be bearing down for the rest of the game on these extremely loose pawns. You could potentially, let's say, break somehow like this, and let's just move pieces around a little bit, and we can inevitably get a battery on this file, and we can try to get some of our knights on squares that could potentially attack any of these pawns that are open. So you can see that while white is still materially ahead, white has serious fractures in their pawn structure, whereas black's is incredibly solid. So in this particular position, I would certainly prefer black's pawn structure, even though white has the quantitative material advantage. Next is space advantage, right? If you have more space, you have more room to work. And if you have more space, that means your opponent has less space. That's why we try to control the center, and we put a lot of effort into controlling the center very early on in the game, because there's only so much space on a chessboard. And the more that you claim for yourself, the more room that you have for your own maneuvering, and conversely, the less room that your opponent has for their own maneuvering. So that can cause issues in and of itself. And lastly, the seizure or the presence of initiative. And what is initiative? Well, consider initiative the same as momentum in a sports game, football or basketball. Sometimes people call it like the mojo or whatever. It is the team that has forward momentum. Which team is actively attacking? Okay. So a person in chess that is attacking has the initiative, and that is good because it's easier to attack than defend in chess. That's from the very beginning. If you can put a threat on your opponent, or they have to answer that threat, you've in essence limited the amount of things that that opponent can do on their next move. And you can restrict and to the extent where you can make your opponent do things that they don't necessarily want to do, or that may not necessarily even be good, in a desperate or otherwise in an effort to try to defend one's own weaknesses, or to defend the threats that their opponent has put on them. So if you continue to issue threats, you have momentum, you have initiative, and people that are constantly issuing threats have an advantage because they're the ones dictating the game. The people answering the threats are the ones being dictated to, and that's a very strong force in a game of chess where only one person moves at a time. So let's talk a little bit about qualitative piece analysis, because that's probably one of the most complex issues in this particular sub-lesson. Whereas we know that bishops and knights are worth 3, and rooks are worth 5, and queens are worth 8. Right? Those are quantitative values of pieces. But let's talk about the qualitative value of pieces. What makes a piece good or bad? Well, we have 4 basic criteria. First is the mobility of the piece. Whereas a mobile piece is an active piece, an immobile piece is a passive piece, which is not, that's not good. We don't want passive pieces. If we go back to our previous example where we had our knight beautifully placed and we had 2 bishops that were stuck behind pawns, we can say that those bishops were relatively immobile because they can't get past their pawns. They're stuck behind their pawns in their own position, so those pieces are relatively passive. Whereas the knight was outside of their pawns and outposted on a very nice square in the white position. So that particular knight was very active. That knight was better than the bishop. It was probably better than both of the bishops put together, because both of those bishops for white were extremely passive, and that knight for black was extremely active. So the qualitative value of that knight greatly surpassed the qualitative value of either of white's bishops. Next, the positioning of a piece. The more centralized a piece it is, the more scope that it has. If it's on an open diagonal or file, the more a piece can move, the better a piece is. The less a piece can move, the worse a piece is. And you can put yourself into a position, and this is especially true with knights, where since they can't move very fast, we need to centralize them and put them in a good position to be relevant in the game. Because if they're off on the side, it could take 1 or 2 moves to get them back into a position where they're relevant again in the game. Whereas a bishop is more active on an open diagonal, and we want to find a position for that bishop where it's going to be sitting on an open diagonal. Same thing for a rook. We want rooks to be sitting on open files or vertical columns. Rooks have more scope and they can reach farther if they're not blocked by either pieces or pawns. So we want to put them on lines that are not blocked by pieces or pawns. Those are the types of positions where we want our pieces to be in to play to their strengths and to be most effective. The third thing that we can think of when we think about the quality of piece is what role is the piece playing? Is the piece in play? For example, a knight on the rim is dim because it's not necessarily in play. A rook that is not developed and that is sitting in the corner, for example this h1 rook, is out of play because for this rook to get into the game, it's going to take at least 1, 2, 3, 4 moves minimum for at least castling to happen, and then probably another move like 5 and then 6 for this rook to be actually placed on an open file where it's actually doing some good in the game. That's a lot of time to expend, so you could definitely say, going back, that that rook that was initially on h1 was out of play. And any piece that takes 6 moves to get active it's a pretty easy assumption to say that that piece is out of play if it takes 6 moves to make it good. Now, is the piece an offensive piece, a defensive piece, or a hybrid piece? As we said, it's better to attack than to defend. And if a piece is defending, it can't really do other things, because if it moves, oftentimes it impacts the safety of the piece that it's defending. This can be even worse because in some instances you are relegated to the defense of a pawn, and that's absolutely the worst and most passive position a piece can be in, because you could have a piece that's worth 3 or 5 or 8 points tied down and rendered immobile to the defense of a pawn that is worth 1 point. So you can see that a small weakness can potentially be compounded because you have to do things to account for the small weakness that ultimately lead to larger and larger weaknesses. And then the last thing is the stability of the piece. How good is a piece? Is it safe? Can it be kicked around? A piece that cannot be kicked around or challenged is stable. A piece that is vulnerable to attack, especially from pieces that are worth less than that particular piece, are not stable. So that's something to consider in our evaluation. That's why we don't bring our queen out very early, because it's very unstable if you bring it out too far too early, because it's very easy for your opponent to attack the queen with literally any other piece, because all other pieces are worth less than the queen, and ultimately that will gain time, which we've talked about already, and that will allow your opponent to be able to continue to develop and improve their position while simultaneously kicking around your unstable pieces and ultimately creating more opportunity for your position to be disjointed. So as far as questions that we can ask ourselves when we're looking at moves to make, it can really address any of the issues that we've already gone over in this lesson. Is my king safe? Is their king safe? How can I make my king more safe or their king less safe? How are my pieces? Are they active? How can I make my pieces more active? How can I make their pieces less active? What are my opponent's threats? How can I counter or parry those threats? How can I prevent my opponent from achieving their plan? What is my plan? How can I use a move to advance my plan while simultaneously either hindering or making it harder for my opponent to actualize their plan? So we can ask ourselves a lot of questions as we're looking at the board, looking for ideas and looking for potential candidate moves. And a lot of that is all going to go back to our cognitive and personal algorithm for decision making, right? What do we see as important in the position? What are the threats? which of those threats are real threats and which of those are ghosts. If we're scared of ghosts, then we're not really addressing the true threats in the position, and we may make a move that is based on fear and emotion rather than on logic and planning. So it's extremely important to look objectively at a position.